Alright guys, and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be counting down the top 10 weird specs from World of Warcraft. So by now I've made quite a few of these videos for each and every expansion, and I thought what I'll do today is make a compilation of all the best weird specs in all of my videos. If you want to see more weird spec videos, I will leave a link to a playlist in the description and comment section of this video. Just before we jump in guys, if you want to see more content like this, I would appreciate it if you did quickly subscribe to the channel. I know a lot of YouTubers do nag about this quite a bit, but you will really be doing me a solid because it really does help out. But anyway, let's jump in. For number 1 we have the Panzerkin, also known as the Boomkin tank. The word Panzer in this nickname does actually mean tank in German. So to understand why such a thing is even possible, you only need to look at the actual tooltip for Moonkin form. Okay, so it increases your armor from items by 400%. Pretty much, I think it's exactly the same as the Dire Bear form, which is very strange if you think about it. Your attack power is increased, again, which is very strange, and melee attacks grant mana, which is even more weird. It almost feels like that Moonkin was intended to be an actual melee build, but it's not really used as a melee build. With these facts in mind, it basically made Boomkins pretty good off tanks, especially when dealing with multiple enemies like adds on a boss encounter, because they had really good cleave AoE damage, which could generate a lot of aggro, and they can just sit there and just tank mobs and soak loads and loads of damage. It's also important to note that the main best in slot druid weapons for feral tank or DPS also increase the attack power in Moonkin form, along as, you know, cat and bear form, which also is very strange, and it almost feels like it's actually intended for Moonkin to have a little bit of a melee role in the Burning Crusade. Most of the time a Panzerkin would just spam cast like Wrath and stuff like that, and the occasional Moonfire, which meant they did run out of mana pretty quickly, to be honest, so mana potions were quite essential, but they could easily outdamage any other tank in the game, so they're actually pretty good at holding threats, particularly AoE threat. So they were actually used from time to time in actual heroic dungeons and certain raid encounters. What the druid would do is stack a little bit of spell power gear, like the typical spell power gear, but the issue is that obviously Boomkin farm a lot of cloth gear when optimizing their spell power gear, which meant that they couldn't really use cloth gear because it wouldn't benefit that much from the armor increase buff. So they'll prioritize getting leather gear and decking out in leather gear, and sometimes they'd have a mixture of spell power leather gear and attack power gear. Ideally, if they were going to tank, they would prioritize increasing their actual defensive capabilities by getting a bigger stamina, well, a bigger health pool and mitigation and things like that. For number 2 we have the Spell Power Melee Hunter, which sounds totally crazy, but this build is influenced by somebody in a comment section called Michael Clark, who's actually made this build do very decent DPS in a raiding environment. I also found a Reddit post, which I'll probably link in the description too, which explains it in a little bit more detail. So most people are probably familiar with the typical Spell Power Hunter that uses Arcane Shot with the Arcane Shot trinket. However, this build was kind of only really viable in an old vanilla patch before they nerfed that trinket. Luckily, there is another way to make a Spell Power Hunter viable through exploiting the Wing Clip ability. So if you don't already know, Wing Clip, since it's a melee attack, obviously counts as a weapon swing, which means it can cause effects to proc, such as weapon procs like the Ancient Hakari Manslayer or the Alcor's Sunraiser. This means when you're spamming Wing Clip, you're doing practically twice as many melee hits, probably even more, and all these useful proc effects have a greatly increased chance to proc and deal their damage. Furthermore, a Spell Power Hunter will exploit items like Dragon's Breath Chili, which gives you a chance to cause fire damage on melee hits, also scaling with Spell Power, 1-to-1 100% scaling, and Shadow Oil, which essentially does the same thing but scales with a little bit less power. I think it's 52%. You can also take the build even further and get items like the Storm Gauntlets that add nature damage on melee attacks, the Dark Moon card Maelstrom with this basically the same effect on a proc, and if you're very lucky, the Blaze Fury Medallion that drops some Doom Lord Kazakh, although the chances of you getting that one probably are fairly slim. Those items don't necessarily scale with spell power, but because you're melee hitting so frequently with obviously your melee swings, dual wielding, and also spamming Wing Clip, the DPS increase is massively worth it. I imagine you would also enchant both weapons of fiery weapons, since that is entirely based on weapon swings, but I can't find any information about what the, enchants are actually used for this build. When it comes to the talents, you speak deep into Beast Mastery to optimise the DPS of your Wind Serpent, and then you dip a toe into the Survival talents to increase the damage of Raptor Strike and your traps. You will actually make use of your traps, even though they don't scale with spell power. They are actually a good DPS increase. It's also optimal to throw in a Serpent Sting since it scales 100% with spell power, but also, only if you're actually allowed the debuff slot by your raid leader. And most of the time you are just going to be spamming a low rank wing clip with Raptor Strike. Preferably you'll be grouped with a Paladin as well for Judgment of Wisdom mana regeneration. So overall, a very unique and interesting build. For number 3, we have the Shaman Tank, which is a bit of a fun build that you can use for flag carrying, since Shamans are pretty good at flag carrying because of Ghost Wolf and actually have a lot of really cool defensive talents. And it can be used in dungeons for tanking very easily, maybe as a temporary off-tank in raiding environments. What you'll notice if you look in the enhancement tree, it's very strange, but there's a number of tanking talents which feel more like warrior talents in the tree, like shield specialization, anticipation, toughness, and the parry talent, which obviously are really strong defensive talents. Shaman was actually originally intended to be a bit of a tank build. It just needs a little bit of extra oomph for it to actually become a actual viable raiding tank. I mean, threat is never really much of an issue because you have Earth Shock, which does like double the amount of threat generation than most abilities. You have Rock Biter weapon, which generates a lot of threat. You also have really cool, awesome talents like Stone Skim Totem. For number 4, we have the Prot Ridin, or the Prot Ret spec, which is a PvP Paladin spec which combined Ret talents and Protection talents. You essentially became beefier with the Protection talent, which meant that you didn't have to use as much PvP gear, so you could use more PvE gear that provided more DPS for the Paladin. You wouldn't use a two-hander, you would actually go for a one-hander and a shield, and use glyphs like Avenged Shield, which doubled its damage but could only be used on a single target, and obviously that ended up hitting like a truck. Then you would get glyphs like Divine Plea and Glyph of Salvation to reduce your damage taken, which meant that you could easily survive in 2v2s, and it's very difficult for you actually to die in double DPS comps. I think overall you did provide less pressure than a typical DPS class, but with the perfect combo and coordination with your arena teammates, you are absolutely lethal. And obviously in 3v3 games you provide excellent support because you're a Paladin and you can do Hand of Freedom, Dispels, all that kind of juicy stuff. And if people were stupid enough to actually focus DPS on you, then they would massively waste their time. People on my live streams have told me that the first content that Towley, the streamer, ever streamed was actually popularising the Protection spec in PvP, so I found that quite interesting. For number 5, we have the Dungeon Hero Death Knight tank build. The ideology of this build is to maximise AoE damage, to clear heroic dungeons as fast as possible, to obviously farm your emblems as fast as possible for your weekly rewards and stuff like that. So as you can see, it maximises your AoE and single target damage while still being able to be a little bit tanky so you don't die too easily. You've got a reduced cooldown on Death and Decay, so it's available every single pull to benefit from the DPS of Death and Decay, which is the highest AoE DPS ability and highest threat generating ability as well. You also got stuff like Impurity to increase magic damage. Basically, whenever you increase magic damage, you're mainly increasing your frost and shadow damage, which increases your dot damage, which in turn is going to increase your AoE damage. Another key ability was Corpse Explosion, which obviously you can benefit from more in a dungeon because there will be more corpses available to use the ability on, so you can probably use it like a couple of times every single trash pull, and the damage from Corpse Explosion was actually really nice. You also got the talent Black Ice for more damage on Death and Decay and dots, and obviously Corpse Explosion. Again, whenever you're increasing your flatline shadow or frost damage, you are just basically increasing your AoE damage. You've got a few talents like Icy Talons for an increased single target DPS buff on bosses. You've got Bladed Armor, which is nice because obviously you stack armor quite high as a tank, which means you benefit from more attack power from that Blood talent. And then a few more basic DPS buffs like Veteran the Third War, which increases your strength and stuff like that. And then another key thing was to get the Glyph of Death and Decay, which increased Death and Decay damage by an extra 20%. So overall, a really high AoE damaging build to clear dungeons as fast as possible. For number 6 we have the Death Concussion Warrior, primarily a PvP build, but a side effect of this build is that you can also be a very competent tank for raids and dungeons, while also having a very strong PvP spec. The build specs deep into the Protection Tree and the Fury Tree to pick up both of the key talents Concussive Blow and Death Wish. Concussive Blow is a mean 5-second stun, usually only available to tanks in a PvE setting, which obviously has its uses, particularly when you can use Death Wish simultaneously to kill somebody within that stun. You also get the opportunity to pick up some really good utility options in the Protection Tree that most warriors don't normally have access to, such as Iron Will, which gives you 15% stun and charm resist, Last Stand, which is obviously pretty ridiculous, Improved Disarm, and you will even have enough talents left over to go over to the Arms Tree to pick up Tactical Mastery. For number 7 we have the Rogue Tank build. So a Rogue Tank was actually really strong, in some cases actually stronger than a typical tank, on bosses that exclusively did melee damage, so boss fights like Gruul, Magfaridon, Tidewalker and Shiraz, because Rogue were basically the only class capable of achieving 100% avoidance. This meant they were just totally immune to melee damage. This was largely possible because rogues gained a lot of avoidance from raw talents, so increased dodge chance, parry chance and stuff like that, and they also gained a lot of dodge chance simply by stacking agility. So one of the main issues of a rogue tank was actually being able to maintain threat, because obviously they don't have a taunting ability or anything like that, or any abilities that generate a lot of threat. Fortunately, they did have a talent called Setup, which caused a rogue to gain combo points after a dodge, which allowed the rogue to generate combo points much faster than usual to basically deal more damage and deal more threat. It was also aided by the ability Riposte, which occurs after a parry, which will deal 150% of total weapon damage, which is a large chunk of damage, which again would generate loads of threat. So you're generating loads of threat with a talent Setup, generating loads of threat with the ability Riposte. So generating threat by recoiling damage or retaliating damage was actually pretty possible, and you were able to maintain threat basically over any other DPS. You did have to be very well geared though. You wouldn't be able to do this with like worse gear than the other members in the raid. So the main advantage of a tanking road, which actually makes them better than a typical tank, is the simple fact that they literally take 0 damage on these bosses that exclusively do melee damage, so essentially immune to damage, which means the healers could focus on healing the rest of the raid more effectively. It also meant that those tanks could probably spec, well, they could probably wouldn't be able to spec back in the day of TBC, but they'll probably be able to like put on a two-handed weapon or something like that and deal a little bit more damage with a more DPS orientated rotation, which meant they could push more and more damage, and it's just basically make the fight much simpler by cheesing it. For number 8 we have the Warlock tank build. First time you will see any good Warlock tank action in the Burning Crusade was in Gruul's Lair, where 2 Warlocks can tank the boss, well, Kiglar the Crazed, during the boss encounter, well, the first boss encounter inside Gruul's Lair, which has a number of different bosses for you to deal with. And some of those bosses just have really deadly abilities that melee just simply cannot deal with. Therefore, they have to be ranged, basically range tanked. There's another similar situation in a later raid, SSC, with this boss called Leo Ferras the Blind, who turns into a demon now and again, which again just deals loads and loads of damage in a melee area, which melee tanks simply cannot deal with. Well, they can deal with it, they can cheese it, but it's very difficult for them to do so, which is why it's a little bit easier on the raid for it to be range tanked by a Warlock. So Warlock tank actually had major advantages over a typical tank because of their really high spell resistance, which can be very easily achieved simply through raw talents, particularly the Master Demonologist talent, which increased the amount of resistances that they gained with the Fell Hunter summoned. They could easily maintain aggro with Searing Pain, which was an ability that generated a lot of threat with very fast cast time, and they could maintain their health very easily with Siphon Life and Drain Life, Health Stones and all those cool abilities that Warlocks have for their insane survivability. For number 9 we have the Shockadin. Now this was more of a 2v2 or battleground spec, because what it basically did is optimize the DPS output of the Holy DPS spec with a number of different talents from here and there from all the other specs. The main focus was to try and optimize that burst damage, because Holy Paladins could always do a ridiculous amount of burst damage in a short time window. Probably one of the best bursts actually in the game. The only issue was that it had very little uptime. You had to wait quite a while before you can get that burst off again, which wasn't an issue because if you're a healer, then you can try and get your burst off with your arena partner, and then if you didn't kill him, then you could go back to doing a bit of healing instead. And now and again you kind of switch between being defensive and offensive. So it actually was a pretty good 2v2 spec, because you could get that extra edge on your enemy team by having a healer that could just pump out some damage from time to time. When it came to raids, it was very, very rarely seen, just simply by the fact it was very mana hungry and didn't provide that much DPS. I've read some forums of people tryharding this spec on private servers and actually making it work when they stack spell power high enough, use the correct weapon enchants, and also obviously the main thing is the mana regeneration, but if you use tricks to optimize your mana regeneration, then you can kind of counteract that issue. One of the main ways that people did this, particularly the Arcane Mage as well, which we'll move on to later, is using the Alchemist Stone, because the Alchemist Stone would increase the amount of mana regeneration, well, mana you would receive from a mana potion, which massively helped out with mana hungry specs. So yeah, some people made it work, messing around with it, you know, when they had their raids on clear, but that's pretty much it. For number 10, we have the Smite Priest, which has many different renditions over the course of World of Warcraft's lifetime, and now actually, interestingly, in Battle for Azeroth, it does actually exist as a real viable spec. But the journey of the Smite Priest started all the way back in the Burning Crusade, maybe Classic, but I don't really heard of many things going on with Classic, to be honest, more of just a leveling spec in Classic, but people did actually make it work in the Burning Crusade as a raid DPS spec in the early phases of the Burning Crusade, because it was actually quite competitive with the other caster DPS specs. When you were talenting, you specced into a number of key talents that increased your smite damage on your holy damage and things like that. Then you also dipped into discipline to the point where you get power infusion, which is a ridiculously good offensive DPS cooldown. You could also increase your damage even further by being in the same group as a Retribution Paladin, as they had an effect called Sanctuary Aura, which just increased all holy damage by 10%. And you already have an increased 20% holy damage, well, damage on your main abilities by 20%, so an extra 30% damage, just flatline damage, was actually pretty useful. But again, it was only really a spec used in the early phases of the Burning Crusade, because it just didn't scale late into the endgame like Hunters in Classic. The gear just didn't scale well with the spec. But one of the really good advantages was that the fact that you were still able to pull off a decent healing spec. If you needed to heal, you could heal. If you needed to DPS, you could DPS. So you could be flexible with certain fights. Like some fights needed a DPS, you could DPS. If some fights needed a little bit of extra healing because you were struggling with the fight, then you can switch healer. So that playstyle of just being able to switch between two different specs was pretty cool. But anyway guys, that's where I'm going to end the video there. My name is Merrygoblin. Until my next video, ciao.